All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that's like pretty fundamental to any agreement you ever make, right?
Yeah.
Like any contract. Undue influence. It's this legal thing, and we're going to see what it means and why it should matter to you. Like, have you ever wondered, like, were you really free when you signed something? Or were you, I don't know, like pressured in some way?
Yeah, I think everyone's had that experience.
Today, we're going to break down exactly what undue influence is using some sources we've got.
Okay.
We'll figure out when a contract might not even be valid, like it's worthless because your will, your decision wasn't really your own.
Yeah, so basically undue influence, right? It's like at its core, it's this unfair kind of persuasion.
Okay.
You know, it's the kind of persuasion that basically overrides, someone's free will when they're signing a contract or making an agreement. It's not just, oh, hey, I convinced them. It's more like that persuasion comes from like a position of power.
Right.
Or trust, and it leads to a deal that like isn't really voluntary.
Okay, so when we say unfair persuasion, how is that different from someone being a really like convincing salesperson or something like that?
Well, the difference is all about the relationship, you see, and the kind of the imbalance of power between the two people.
Right.
One of our sources pointed out that undue influence often happens when one person in the agreement like has a big advantage over the other, whether it's because of like status or their education or even like an emotional connection, or they depend on them.
Okay.
And this advantage, it's like they use it to like unfairly push the weaker person into a decision that really only benefits the influencer, the person with all the power.
Right.
It's really different from a normal negotiation where two people are kind of like on equal footing.
So I'm thinking of like, I don't know, a landlord-tenant situation.
Okay.
And the tenant feels like they're pressured to sign a lease super quickly. Like they don't even get to like understand all their rights.
Right.
Could that be a situation where like undue influence might be happening?
Yeah.
Especially if there's this, power dynamic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially when a tenant, maybe they're facing eviction, they're in a really vulnerable position. Any pressure at all from the landlord that stops them from making a clear-headed choice about their housing, that could definitely be undue influence.
Right. And then the agreement might not even be valid.
Exactly.
Okay. So what should we be looking for here? Like, what are the red flags? What are those key elements of undue influence?
So there are a few things to keep in mind. The first thing is like the vulnerability of the person who's being influenced, right? Our sources say like this vulnerability could come from like their age, if they're, older, or if they're sick, or maybe they have a disability, or maybe it's more emotional, like they're really stressed out, or they depend on the other person for something.
Right.
Imagine someone who's in the hospital, right?
Yeah.
And they're pressured to sign something important. They're not really in a position to like stand up for themselves, are they?
Yeah, it makes sense. They're already at a disadvantage.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second thing. It's the power or the trust that the influencer has, the person who's doing the influencing. Okay. It's not just about, being able to talk someone into something. It's about having this position of, authority over them.
Right.
Both of our sources, they really emphasize that. It's like they already have this relationship, right? And now they're using it to get what they want.
So it's not just a random person. It's someone you know.
Yeah, someone you might trust. Someone who you might think has your best interests at heart. And that brings us to the third thing, unfair persuasion.
Okay.
One of the sources described it as like excessive tactics, things that are just not fair.
Okay.
So, for example, they might like isolate the person from their family. The people who'd normally give them advice and support. Or they might threaten them.
Yeah.
Maybe even not tell them crucial information, stuff that would affect their decision.
There's like straight up manipulation.
Right. And then sometimes it's even sneakier. Like they play on the person's emotions or they take advantage of that trust they've built up over time.
Right. Okay.
And then the last thing to consider is like, what was the result of this whole thing? Was it fair?
Okay.
Our sources talk about an inequitable result. That means the agreement, the contract, it's totally unfair to the person who was pressured, the victim.
Right.
And it usually benefits the influencer a lot. So you see, it's all these factors together, the vulnerability, the power imbalance, the unfair tactics, and the unequal outcome. That's when you really start to see a case for undue influence.
So it's really the whole picture. You got to look at everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Our sources also mentioned something kind of interesting. They said that in some relationships, the law automatically assumes there's undue influence, even without proof.
Right. It's called a presumption of undue influence.
Wow, that sounds like a big deal. Like, when does that even happen?
Well, because there are some relationships where it's just so clear that one person has a lot of control over the other. And the law, recognizes that.
Makes sense.
So our first source gives us some examples. Parent and child.
Right.
Doctor and patient, lawyer and client.
Yeah.
Religious leader and follower.
Yeah.
And even husband and wife.
Oh, wow.
In all these situations, the power dynamic is just baked in.
Yeah.
And the law wants to make sure that any agreement they make, like a transfer of property or something, is actually voluntary.
That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't even thought about, spouses being in that category.
Yeah. And, in these specific relationships, if a contract really benefits the person with more power, then boom, presumed undue influence.
Okay.
And now, according to our second source, the burden of proof shifts.
What does he mean?
It means it's on the person with the power to prove they didn't actually use that power. It's on them to show that the weaker person, the other person, they agreed to it freely. They understood everything. And they even got independent advice, if needed.
Okay.
For example, a lawyer who suddenly makes a business deal with their client, and the deal, overwhelmingly favors the lawyer.
Right.
That lawyer better be able to prove that the client got advice from another lawyer, one who wasn't involved in the deal.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it looks really shady.
Really shady. So let's say, undue influence is actually proven in court.
Right.
What happens to that contract?
So generally, if a court decides that undue influence was involved, they'll say that the contract is voidable.
Voidable.
Both our sources are very clear about that.
Okay.
So voidable just means, it's not automatically canceled.
Okay.
The person who is, unfairly pressured, they get to choose. Okay.
They can either say, yeah, I still want to go ahead with this deal, or they can say, nope, I'm out.
So they're not stuck with it.
No, not at all.
They have options.
Yeah. The law gives them that power because, their consent, their agreement in the first place, it wasn't really free.
Right.
Now, our second source, they even mention that sometimes in really bad situations, the agreement can be totally void from the start.
Like it never existed.
Yeah, like it never happened. But that's in cases where there was a lot of coercion, and other factors involved.
Okay. Now, this whole thing about proving undue influence in court, that sounds really hard. What kind of evidence do they even look at?
Well, our first source kind of breaks it down. You got to start by proving that the victim, the person who was influenced, that they were actually vulnerable.
Okay.
So, think their age, their health, any disabilities, how much they depended on the influencer.
Okay. All
that stuff. And then you got to show that the influencer actually had this, position of authority.
Right. That there was a power imbalance. And this is key. You have to show what tactics they used, for the unfair persuasion. Did they isolate the person? Did they pressure them, lie to them, use their emotions against them?
Right.
And lastly, you got to show that the contract was totally unfair to the victim.
Okay, yeah.
So it's not just one thing, it's the whole picture,
The whole story.
Yeah, you got to convince the court that this person didn't really have a choice.
Right.
That their free will was taken away.
Now, our sources had some, real life examples of this stuff to help us understand better. Can we, go through some of them?
Yeah, definitely. So one common example that both sources mention is, a caregiver, someone who's taking care of an elderly person.
Okay.
And they pressure that elderly person to sign over, their house or their money, right? Because the elderly person, they're vulnerable. They might depend on the caregiver.
Yeah.
And the caregiver, they're in a position of trust.
Right.
That's textbook undue influence. Another example is, a doctor who uses their authority to make a patient invest in something.
Okay.
Or a religious leader who, manipulates their followers into giving them a bunch of money.
Right.
Or even, a family member who pressures someone into signing a really bad contract. It's all about abusing power.
That's really messed up.
It is. And our second source, they had that really memorable example, remember, with Bert and Ernie.
Oh, yeah, Bert and Ernie. I remember that. Tell me about it again.
So Bert was a therapist, right?
Right.
And Ernie was his patient. And Bert, he had this position of, trust and influence over Ernie.
Yeah, of course.
And then one day, Ernie mentions that his friends are investing in a real estate project. And guess what? Bert was involved in that project.
Oh.
Instead of like staying professional, keeping that therapist-patient boundary,
Right.
Bert actually convinced Ernie that this investment would be good for his personal growth, even though Ernie wasn't like financially ready and he wasn't even that interested.
He was just trying to manipulate him.
Exactly.
Wow.
And in the end, Bert made a bunch of money and Ernie was left with all the risk.
That is so messed up.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of using trust to take advantage of someone.
Now, speaking of different contexts, Source 2 briefly talked about undue influence in the financial markets, too.
Oh, yeah.
It's like way bigger than just individual relationships, right?
It is. It's not just about personal stuff. Undue influence can happen in huge companies, too.
Yeah.
Like, imagine someone with insider information using that to pressure others into making a deal.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like, powerful people in a company forcing the board of directors to vote a certain way.
Right.
It's the same principle, just on a larger scale.
It's still about, like, unfair persuasion, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I remember the source suggested that, like, having independent third parties involved could help prevent that.
Absolutely. Having someone neutral, someone who's not part of the company, that can make a huge difference. They can help make sure everyone's acting fairly.
Okay. Now, one more thing before we wrap up. One of our sources, I think it was the one called Understanding Undue Influence in Contract Law.
Mm-hmm.
It talked about the difference between undue influence and duress.
Oh, yeah, that's important.
Can you quickly explain that?
Yeah, so there are both ways a contract can be messed up, right?
Right.
But duress is more about direct threats, like someone threatening to hurt you.
Okay.
Or do something illegal if you don't sign.
Wow.
It's about being forced into something because you're scared.
Right.
Undue influence, like we talked about, it's usually more subtle, right? It's about abusing trust or authority.
Yeah.
So think of it this way. Duress is like a punch in the face.
Okay.
And undue influence is more like a slow poison.
Wow, that's a good analogy. So, okay, last question. What are some practical things people can do to protect themselves from undue influence? Especially, when they're signing important contracts.
Yeah, I think our source, Understanding Undue Influence in Contract Law, they give some really solid advice.
Okay.
Number one, always get your own lawyer to look over any big document before you sign it.
Right.
Having someone who's on your side who can explain everything clearly, that's crucial.
Totally.
Number two, don't let anyone rush you.
Okay.
Take your time, think it over, make sure you understand everything.
Right.
And number three, full transparency. Make sure all the information is out in the open, no hidden surprises.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And if you ever feel pressured or you're unsure about anything, especially in like a landlord-tenant situation, talk to a lawyer. Seriously, it's worth it.
Absolutely. All right, so to wrap up, it seems like undue influence is all about like recognizing when someone might be messing with your ability to make a free choice, especially in situations where there's a power difference.
Yeah.
And if you can prove it, that contract might not even be valid.
Yeah, it's a really important legal concept. It's about protecting people from being manipulated, especially when they're in a vulnerable position.
Right. So to all our listeners out there, think about your own relationships, your own agreements. Have you ever felt pressured? Have you ever felt like your free will was like kind of being chipped away at?
Yeah, it's worth thinking about.
And knowing about undue influence, it can help you spot those situations and protect yourself.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.